everyone, and welcome to this live interview. I'm so excited to see you all alive 2 weeks in a row. Today we are going live with Dr Cheryl McGeachan, a senior lecturer from the School of Geographical Earth Sciences from the University of Glasgow, to explore geographies of mental health. We're going to investigate why place is important for human life and how connection of place influences mental health and well-being. And this live interview is brought with you from with Time for Geography and in partnership with Glasgow University. So I'm just going to pass over to Cheryl now, and if you wouldn't mind telling us, as a geographer, why are you interested in mental health or mental ill health?
So hello everyone, it's such a pleasure to be here. So I've always been truly fascinated by people and their stories and how people live in the world and sort of engage in the world. So that for me just felt like a really natural connection to geography, because essentially in lots of ways what human geography is it's the stories of people's connection with the earth. And so that just really felt to me that was a connection. And then I thought about my own personal story. So in terms of my own lived world realities, I grew up in a family where mental ill health was very present, particularly in the form of addiction. And so for me, it was very, very natural to live alongside mental ill health. And I've continued that up until the present day, where some of the very closest people to me experience mental ill health. And so when I sort of came to study geography at university and then take it on as a career, it just felt very natural to connect the two together. And one of the reasons why I really saw the potential to think about the connections as a geographer was when I was living, and am living, alongside people with mental ill health, I witnessed the injustices that they experience. So whether that be stigmatization, or maybe they're just devalued or even treated perhaps unkindly in certain kinds of ways. And I really wanted to challenge that and change that. And I think that's something so incredible about geography. It has the potential to create positive change. And so I wanted to bring the two together to try and explore them in a bit more detail.
Fantastic, thank you. And if anybody does have any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll either ask Cheryl as we go along if they're relevant, or we can pause them and answer them at the end. So I think that's what's really great about geography, is that a lot of people bring those kind of personal experiences into their own research. So if you wouldn't mind telling us, Cheryl, about some of your research and kind of what have you found out?
Yeah, so my work focuses on mental ill health, so how people experience living in a world with mental ill health. And lots of people research mental health, so we all have mental health. And sometimes our mental health is really good, sometimes it's not so good, and it sort of goes in peaks and troughs throughout our life. And some people like to focus on the challenges of mental health. So why do people get unwell, for example? What kind of treatments can people have, and what is really successful? But I was really interested, and am really interested in just really focusing on what does it mean, or what does it feel like to live with mental ill health. And I look at this both historically. So I look at things in the past. So if you're doing geography and history together, they're amazing sister subjects. They work really, really well together. So I look at it both in the past, but I also look at it in the present day as well. And the things that I'm really, part of my research is exploring the connections between creativity and mental ill health. So what are those connections? What can we do to think about creative practice, whether it's art or music or theatre, whatever it is? How can we look at that as an experiential expression of mental ill health? And what does it tell us about people's lived realities? And I've been working with a collection called Art Extraordinary. So it's a very cool collection. It's a collection of what's known as outsider art, and I don't know if anyone sort of come across outsider art, but outsider art effectively is art made by everyday people. So people like you, people like me, who just make things to show an expression of themselves, an expression of their world. They're not artists necessarily, they're just everyday people using everyday objects that they find to create things. And there's this amazing collection of outsider art that was collected in Scotland, and it's called Art Extraordinary. And I thoroughly recommend you checking it out. If you're ever in Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, there's a little exhibition that you can have a look at. And I worked with this collection in collaboration with lots of different people. And I think, again, that's something that's really, really cool about geography. Geographers very rarely work in isolation. So they often work collaboratively. They work with other people, because to solve the world's biggest problems, we need to work collectively. We need to work collaboratively. And geographers are really, really skilled at doing that. And so I worked with mental health nurses, museum curators, archivists, communities with lived experience. I worked in all kinds of places like schools, hospitals, museums, prisons, all kinds of different places to try and research what is this connection between creativity and mental ill health. And I don't know if you can show the picture of the mouse, but this mouse that you can see on your screen, this is an example of just one of the items from the Art Extraordinary collection. And this mouse was found in a dustbin of a hospital. So the hospital was closing down because they closed lots and lots of psychiatric institutions in a process that was called deinstitutionalisation. So they were changing the landscape of mental health care in the UK. So they were closing down all the hospitals. So as the hospitals were closing down, they were just emptying all their cupboards and throwing things away. And so someone found this mouse nestled in one of the bins. So they took it out the bin. And what we know nothing about the person who made it. But what we do know by dating it is it dates from the 1900s. So it's over 100 years old. And if you look really closely at it, if you can see its little whiskers, so its whiskers are made out of a scrubbing brush, so a cleaning brush from the hospital floor. Its little hands and feet are canisters, so they are from the wheels of a bed, basically, and then you can see its little button eyes. That's from the bedding of the hospital. So someone put this together to express themselves and left it behind for us to think through, for us to research. And this person was clearly in that institution at some time. And one thing that I think is really neat about this mouse is that it predates Mickey Mouse, which means that this mouse was made and in existence before Mickey Mouse ever came into existence. So it maybe is the world's most famous, most famous mouse. Who knows? But it's just one of the items from the collection that we can use to start thinking about that relationship between creativity and mental health.
And I wonder now whether it might be quite useful to talk about your research methods. So a lot of students, throughout school, conduct fieldwork, and particularly when you get to A level, they undertake their own independent investigations. What kind of research have you undertaken as a geographer? So I know students are familiar with, say, interviews and questionnaires, but what research methods have you used? And how have you managed to also incorporate creativity in your research methods?
Yeah, what a great question. So methods are really important because they, I guess, are the foundations for the research that you wanted to explore how they felt.
Sorry, Cheryl. Would you mind just repeating that answer? I put you on mute instead of myself. So just from the beginning, the importance of research methods. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay. So methods are really, really important because they're the kind of scaffolding for the project that you do and all the kind of conversations that you have. So you have to think really carefully about the kinds of methods that you want to do and you want to use. And so, as I mentioned before, my work is really about understanding people's experience. So it's not about explaining something. So if you're trying to do an explanatory project, you might use more quantitative or more numerical methods to try and map that. And that's perfectly wonderful if that's what you want to do. But for me, it was, how does it feel? What does your experience look like? So I had to really talk to people to find that out. And so a lot of my work was with people with lived experience of mental health. So I did a lot of workshop based work, because some people that were in psychiatric care or maybe in the prison system, maybe one-to-one interviews were maybe a little bit intimidating or a little bit too much in that context. So bringing people together as a group and doing an art activity while we discussed and while we talked about things was a much nicer and more collaborative method. So lots of talking to people, lots of interviewing, and lots of creative work as well. So lots of people made a lot of really cool things during our workshops as well. But often when you're trying to do geography work that seeks to understand someone's experience, it really is about speaking to those people and hearing things in their words the way that they want to express them. So that, and I love talking to people, so that was a fun thing for me to do.
Fantastic. And did you have a set of questions, or kind of was it like semi-structured that you had some parts, or was it just completely exploratory that you used, maybe you saying the kind of creativity as like a stimulus to then start discussions? How did you go about kind of forming and chatting to find out about their lived experience?
Yeah, so it was both, really. I think it's always useful to go in with themes. So maybe not questions unless it's a more formal interview and then you need to ask certain things in a certain way. Or I definitely, when I started my research career, I wasn't very confident. So I used to write everything down, every word that I wanted to say. And that was helpful for me at the time. But often it's themes. So things that I wanted to talk about. So I might have wanted to talk about hospitals, or I might have wanted to talk about location or creative practice. And I would sort of make sure that in the conversation, I was bringing up those topics, but I was phrasing the questions in line with the person that I was communicating with. So sometimes I could talk in a more academic way. Sometimes I would have to talk in a different kind of way to get people to understand and communicate with me. So yeah, I think themes is the way that I would use it.
Yeah, fantastic. And you just talked about some really good parts in terms of like pitching, because I think sometimes we forget, even when you say very what you would consider geographical words in our kind of everyday geography, like regeneration and gentrification, sometimes people interpret them in different ways as well. So kind of really thinking about the words that you're using when you're interviewing and kind of how that might change for the person that you're kind of working with. And did you just like remember kind of what they were saying, and how did you record it as a kind of geographer?
Yeah, so again, I think these are such important things to think about when you're doing your project, aren't they? And again, I think it's thinking about them in relationship to the situation you're in, because everybody will be doing different work, and certain things work for one person and don't always work for another. But I certainly would remember things because in the circumstances I was in. So for example, when I was working in prisons, you couldn't take recording equipment in while we were doing it. So it would often be, as soon as I left, I would get my notebook out and I would write down, not word for word what anyone says, because my memory is not that good. But what I would do is just really write out my interpretation of the day and what happened and what people did and all of that kind of thing as well. But certainly in other interviews, and now we're using a lot of online methods, of course, recording interviews can be a great thing if the participant is okay with that. For you to go back and rewatch it and see what actually was said as well. So there's lots of different ways that I've done it, but certainly it does depend on the situation that you're in, and always, of course, what the participant is comfortable with. Some people don't like being recorded.
Yeah, I think that's great in terms of the just like adapting to the situation. And that actually, in terms of your kind of standard interview, there's so many ways that you can do it in different ways. So actually, when I was at university, I was really interested in art and graffiti, and so we did kind of like talking interviews where I would kind of walk with them through the kind of streets of Bristol, and you can gather reactions as well. So it's more than just, I think, it's not what they said, it's also how people are speaking and that kind of emotion attached with it as well. So yeah, lots to kind of play with if students are undertaking research. In changing places for A level, and students learn about kind of place and urban environments or rural environments throughout kind of their geography education, but particularly in kind of changing places, students investigate why place is important for human life and belonging. And in your opinion, how does connection to place link to mental health and well-being?
Yeah, so I think place is such a fundamental geographical concept, and it's so important because it really is the space where our emotional worlds collide and come together. So it's such a complex concept, but it's one that we all really want to embrace. And actually, it's a lot of fun to think through aspects of place. And we often think about it very positively. So we think about aspects of connection, of belonging, of feeling safe, secure, happy. All of these things we often associate with place. And what exploring mental ill health can do is it can help us to think about what happens when those connections break or are broken or are fractured in some kind of way. So it helps us to sort of flip place around a little bit and to see it in a kind of more complex way. And we can do this historically. So if we think about mental ill health historically, if you were identified as someone who had a mental health condition, often the spatial strategy that society came up with was to remove you from your place, so remove you from your home and your community, and to put you into an institution, so a new type of place that disconnected you from your old previous connections. And we know from a lot of research that's been done into these institutions, which were historically seen as asylums, they were called, then they were called mental hospitals. We know that that could have a really damaging and negative impact on people to be so disconnected from where they felt safe, secure, where they felt they belonged. And obviously, everybody's experience is different, so not everyone felt that way, but the vast majority of people, when your connection with place is broken, it can be quite harmful. And we can think about that in the contemporary world as well. So this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, which is so cool that we've been able to do this on Mental Health Awareness Week. And the theme of the year is anxiety. And anxiety is a very common mental health condition. It can also be a very difficult one to experience and one to live with. And what anxiety can do in relationship to place is it can completely transform the nature of places for people experiencing anxiety. So we can think about it maybe in terms of the school classroom. So we take the school classroom, maybe a place where people feel safe, comfortable, relaxed. It might even be a fun space to be as well. For someone who then experiences anxiety, that whole place can change dramatically. It can feel unsafe, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel anxiety inducing. And so thinking about if we understand that person's experience of that place, rather than maybe just think, oh, that person's not coming to school anymore because they don't care, they're lazy, they're disengaged, they're troublesome. Actually, if we understand the complexities of what it feels like with anxiety to be in that place, we can actually put in motion things that can help support that person. We can understand their situation. So we can maybe say, oh, maybe that person has to come to the classroom early rather than at the time when the bell goes. Maybe that person needs to be supported by someone. Maybe the classroom isn't a place for learning at the moment until they feel a little bit better. So by thinking about understanding the connections between mental ill health and place, we can really create kinder, more accepting and more just worlds, I think. So I think it's a really important concept to think about alongside mental health.
I thought that interesting. The example you were giving about people being removed, like historically as well. Is it that the people just become, because they're detached from place, and then it's detached from those like emotions, and then they're in a new place, so making maybe more negative connections? Is that like some of the reasons why it might form more like discontent with place?
Yeah, I think to be disconnected from where you feel comfortable, where you feel safe, particularly where you feel you belong, can be damaging, because it can actually set in motion a lot of negative thoughts around your place in the world. You don't know who you are, you don't know where you belong, you don't have that grounding. And often people in any situation, so if you look at some migrants' experiences of being dislocated, that sense of being dislocated from where you feel safest, where you feel you belong, is hugely problematic for your sense of self, your sense of achievement, your sense of who you are. And we all want to know who we are, don't we? We all want to feel like we have a place in the world, and so it can be really disassociating to be disconnected, and especially when it's not your choice. And that's what's really important in mental health care, but also other things. If some people's experience of going to a new place to get better was really positive, and that's maybe because they wanted to do that. That was a good decision for them. Their place at home maybe wasn't the safest space for them, and to go somewhere else was really positive. But to be removed from somewhere when it's not what you want to do, that can be when it's really problematic. Yeah.
And it kind of links to the ideas in, for A level, they discuss the ideas of insiders and outsiders, and how you can feel kind of like an outsider to a place. So in terms of like migration as well, and then how maybe things such as like learning a language can kind of make you feel a bit more kind of like included in that place as well. So how there's that transition, or if something's negative, as you said, negative experiences happen, say crime in a place, can make someone feel more like an insider to like an outsider as well. So kind of, I don't know if you talk much about insiders and outsiders, but I think geography students find that quite interesting in terms of that connection to place.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of key things about places that places are always, we talk about it as influx. That's the way, the kind of terminology of places are always changing. No place stays the same all of the time. And that's because things are always moving. So people are always coming in and out of places. There's flows of money and capital and different kinds of social forces always moving around. And so people don't stay static either. You don't stay the same from childhood right the way through to your adult life. We are always changing too. But what's really complex about this kind of insider outsider is who gets to decide who's an insider and who's an outsider. And sometimes that's decisions that we make for ourselves, our communities, but alongside this idea of a historic sense of removing people to an institution because they're deemed as different from the rest of society. And that can be extremely problematic, because if we just confine things that we don't understand, so we just push away things that we don't want to deal with, what happens is we don't understand them. So they become scary, they become othered, they become different. Whereas if we learn to engage in the places that we're in with everyone together and manage those differences, they can be complicated and they can be challenging, but if we can see them and engage with them, then again we can really understand them and really make these kinder worlds. So it's that really interesting aspect when we're looking at places. Who gets to decide? Who decides if you're an insider or an outsider? And those are, I think, really cool conversations. And that's again why geography is such an interesting subject, because it really allows you that aspect of exploring yourself, but also exploring your worlds, also thinking about how do others see me, how do others see my community, and sort of engaging and learning through that. I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, fantastic. If anybody does have any questions, just please do write them in the chat. I've kind of got a few more to go, but yeah, it'd be great to hear if there's anyone's there. I wondered, in terms of what we're talking about, who decides and about being taken away from place, so say prisons, I might be wrong in my location of this, but there is, I don't know if it's like Finland or a country near Finland that has, I saw a video about how prisons were much more kind of like open spaces, green spaces, much more about kind of rebuilding the person and not kind of being locked away. I wondered if you knew anything about that and how that's maybe as instead of like that kind of punishment, and you said it about being a much more kinder world. Whether you had any thoughts on that or knew any more about that.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I think a lot of Nordic countries are actually very, very progressive in terms of their thinking around these things. But I think one of the other things is we're always trying to come up with spatial solutions to things. So again, that's why being a geographer is pretty awesome, because actually society is always thinking spatially, and then if we want to try and intervene in some of these, being a geographer is a really powerful thing, because you can talk in the language of space, and come up with these solutions. But certainly the idea of a more humane approach to thinking about people's experience and how to, I guess, engage with complex life, whether that be in the prison or other kinds of systems, is something that lots of people have tried throughout the centuries, and we're still trying. So we've still not quite got it right. We're still debating it as well, because often people have diverse views on what we should do and how we should do it. But what we always come back to time and time again is we spatialize that. So either we remove, or we bring closer, or we contain in a certain way. And you think about the pandemic, what did we do? We came up with a spatial solution, which was to stay at home, which was very sensible. But again, it's that idea that the geographies really matter. And so I think from my personal point of view, I'm very much for a progressive system of prison reform, if you like, which is this idea that we need to have a greater understanding and connection with these people rather than an isolation quality. But people think very differently, and I think it's being open and respectful to all of those views, and seeing where we come to. But I definitely think Scotland is a very interesting place at the moment for thinking about prisons as well. So yeah, there's lots of places trying out different solutions, if that's the right word, different interventions, I suppose.
And my next kind of question, before we kind of go on to our final question, which is kind of how did you get to where you are, was actually linked to the pandemic, and about any kind of observations or kind of things that you had seen, because obviously people were kind of taken away, or were just in their house as their place, and in some ways people had that kind of stronger connection to place. Like around me there was all the kind of clapping for the NHS, and we have like a community WhatsApp on our road, so there's obviously that like stronger kind of community to place. But for a lot of people it has been really hard in terms of like mental ill health and addiction, and a lot of factors which maybe COVID have accelerated for some people, or put them in situations being detached from people where they have struggled with their mental health. I wondered if you had any observations on how pandemic has impacted mental health and place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge question, and I think we're still trying to understand what even happened, what's going on for people. And I think I have nothing but admiration for young people who have done the most brilliant job being in education and coming through a pandemic. I think you're all wonderful. But I think again, it comes back to choice. You know, people didn't choose to stay at home. People didn't choose necessarily to be isolated, or to lose that sense of connection. And so while some people thrived, and for some people it was a really powerful motivation, as you say, to get to know your community, to become part of a community, other people felt that it was a way of disconnecting them from their work environment, from maybe their friends, their family, all of these kind of things. So again, it comes back to, it's not a universal thing. Place is highly individual. It's something that means something to you that might not mean the same thing to the person that lives next to you. And so understanding people's different engagements with place is really important. But we do know that if you're not, we are social animals, and so we need social interaction in whatever form that suits us as an individual. We need that connectivity in order to build places. And I think a lot of rebuilding is needed and is going on at the moment, I think, across the world, which will hopefully start to come out a little bit more of this pandemic times in the future.
Fantastic. And I think that themes of what you've talked about as in place being highly individual, and changing, like individuals changing and then place changing around as well, I think it was what makes it really interesting as a geographer to look at as well. I was saying earlier to Cheryl that it's very different teaching it compared to, say, the more kind of like classic geography knowledge-based topics, because it is much more discussion-based and everybody brings their personal experience, whether that is to do with like migration or moving and kind of having this experience of one place your whole life or different places as well. So you're based at the University of Glasgow, and actually you're kind of from near that area as well. So I feel like you must have a very strong connection to Glasgow. But if you wouldn't mind telling us, as a kind of our final question, is how did you get to where you are? And then do you have any advice for students taking their next steps?
Yeah. So I feel quite fraudulent saying I had a career plan. I definitely didn't. I came to university because I didn't know what else to do. I just was kind of good at school, and I thought, oh, well, okay, why not? But one thing that I did, and I think it comes back to the beginning, is I just followed what I cared about. And I was just really passionate about, as I said, mental health, people's experiences, stories. And so I actually came to university to study literature. But because I came to Scottish University, you do other subjects alongside your first subject. And so I did geography because my geography teacher was amazing, which they tend to be. And so I thought I'll do geography, and I did it as my second subject, and I just loved it. I loved the freedom. I loved the positivity and the hopefulness of it. I loved the field work and the chatting to everyone. And so I ended up just doing my degree and carried on with geography. But I think it is that idea. My only really advice would be to follow what you're passionate about. And whatever it is, think about how do you get from that passion to a lived reality of exploring that passion. So if you want to, whatever you want to be, whether you're just really passionate about climate science, or you're passionate about humanitarian causes, or you're just passionate about food, whatever it is you're passionate about, think about how can you practically engage with that in whatever steps it takes. So whether that's coming to university or getting an apprenticeship or whatever it might be, think about how you can just be so attached to that passion. And I guess the other thing would be, please ask for help and support. If it is, for example, that you want to come to university, but maybe you're thinking, oh, there's a barrier there, maybe there's a barrier, maybe you think, oh, people like me don't go to university, etc. I mean, I was very much from a background that, you know, people didn't really go to university, and you can overcome those barriers, but you often can't do it on your own. You often need support from people to be able to feel more empowered and feel more confident. So I would say, if you're really inspired and you really want to come, don't let anything stop you. It might take you a little bit longer. You might have to go through different routes, but you can get there. So I just make sure you ask your teachers, ask the universities themselves, is there programs I can get involved in, summer schools, widening participation, any kind of scholarship scheme. Just keep badgering the university for what you want, and just, don't let it stop you. Just follow that passion, and just be really driven. And hopefully, and I think with geography, if you're thinking about geography, it's a subject where every voice matters, every voice counts, and every voice is heard. So your experience can be a real part of your degree, and I think that is such a wonderful thing. So don't let anything stop you. That would be my my advice.
Fantastic. And we do actually have, which is fantastic, I love it when we have questions come in. So Cheryl, if you don't mind us holding on for you for a couple more minutes before we say goodbye, is that we have a question saying, can you talk about moving place to place as a result of homelessness, the impact of this and insecurities, and possible mental health techniques to cope with this that you might have, if you've done any research around that?
I think it's a fantastic question. I think we know that the majority of people who are homeless or identify as homeless have a mental health condition of some kind or experience mental ill health. So we know the two are very closely linked. And as you've really cleverly identified, there's a connection there between a sense of a disconnection to place, a sense of a lack of belonging, that can be really influential in terms of homelessness. And although there is a lot of complexity there, because I think there's a lot of stigma around homelessness, there's a lot of misunderstanding about why people are homeless or what's going on for them in their worlds. And so I think it's it's a more complicated set of geographies than maybe we have time to think about today. But there is a lot of research out there on homelessness and geography and people's experience and physically mapping the geographies of homelessness as well. And I think one of the really troubling things that we're seeing at the moment is that is increasing. So the number of homeless people is on the increase in the UK, actually globally, but in the UK as well. So there's a lot. It's a really great question, but I think I think it's a complicated geography and something that we definitely need more people to research and think about in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for just being so kind of informative about your different research methods, your own research, and kind of really like helping to unpick this idea of like place and connection. We talked about insiders and outsiders. Yeah, it was a really fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Time for Geography and the Curious Geographer as a live interview.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody, and then I'll just put on the final so people know where to go. So everybody, thank you so much again for joining. If you check out the Time for Geography website, we have some shorter kind of highlight in curious kind of small videos that you can use. And this video in live interview will be made into a shorter video as well. So definitely check that out when it comes along. And then a massive good luck for those students taking their A-level paper 1 tomorrow. I just had some questions saying any top tips. Make sure you read the question. Try to link to scale in your evaluation or throughout. Make sure you bring a highlighter to make sure you're answering the question first of all, so you're dissecting that. And be conscious of timings because all papers are quite long. You just need to manage your time. So a huge good luck to all our A-level geographers and GCSE geographers later on. And a massive thank you again to Cheryl and University of Glasgow. And I'll see you all next week.